heading up to a little place called Cedar Pocket, which is located in southeast Queensland and which hosts a privately managed sustainable plantation which is just coming up to harvest. This week we'll be catching up with Sean Ryan, who's a forester with a little over 50 years experience in the industry and who's a proud advocate for sustainable management of both private and native forests. Hopefully this week we'll learn a little bit about private plantations and maybe a few tricks on the chainsaw as well. So what's the main reason why you created a plantation on your property?
Well, this property, and you'll see various footage of it, it was one of the properties that was split up just after the First World War. They were called soldier settlement farms, and they basically just got country and they split up. In this case, nearly all of these blocks around here was split up into 125 acre or 50 hectare blocks. And a lot of the time those blocks just weren't really big enough to, and particularly in today's term, they're just not big enough to provide for a grazing farm, and particularly because this country it's very steep. You know, we've got flats, and when we've got steep country, and then we've got very steep country, which is basically, you know, it's that area is really just environmental reserve because it's too steep to manage, and so it was actually probably the best enterprise suited to this farm. And now, while it takes sort of 25 years really before you start to get a decent return, from then on it should be fairly continuous, because we go through and we only pick out the trees that are ready for harvest or reach their maximum amount of value. And so a lot of those stumps reshoot, and then you get that coppice and you manage that coppice into the second generation of plantation.
So really it is quite a sustainable thing. Once you've got it established, you'll be able to keep going at it. And
yeah, and you know, you can still graze cattle through it. In fact, you know, once they're 2 years old, you can reintroduce cattle into it, and it's a good way of actually keeping the grass and the woody weeds under control. So it becomes a dual enterprise, probably dominated by timber in the longer run, but the cattle serve a management purpose, that's for sure.
The saw's sharpened, we might as well head down into the plantation and take a look at what trees we've got today. one of our last trees of the day. Dad's just finished debarking a few logs and we're just going to head down the bottom here, what we call Snake Gully. There's a couple of big trees down there, so hopefully just only need 1 or 2 to go for the day and we're done. You still got a couple of logs here to pull out, do you?
Yeah, I actually forgot about this one.
Oh yeah. I'm going to go down through here. That'll work.
Yeah.
It's tall, isn't it?
Fucking tall, yeah.
Down here in Snake Gully, as you call it, in your private managed forest. I guess before we get into any of the trees, why is it important that we have forestry in Australia and to be able to log trees?
Well, the alternative is to bring hardwoods in from very unsustainable places like West Papua or New Guinea or Solomon Islands, and frankly, it's not just the ecological impacts of harvesting in those countries, it's the social impact, particularly in West Papua and even in New Guinea, that you know, it's managed, or the harvests are directed by international bodies, and they're just in for the removal of the timber, and they frankly don't give a damn about the locals, and the locals get ripped off by them and the forest gets destroyed, and those forests just don't regenerate unless you really do a lot of work at them, mainly because of the vine levels. But in Australia it's very different. Our forests regenerate very quickly and generally more than you can possibly deal with. So our forests are very different to their forests, and managed well, it's a very simple process to continue that sustainable management of that forest. So in this situation, it's a hardwood plantation. It's quite different to native forests, but nevertheless, the end result is the same. It's the result is in a framework of forest with good quality trees that can be utilised for a whole range of indoor and external use. It's very durable wood. It's very strong wood, so it can be used for hardwood construction, particularly externally, like verandas and veranda floors. But it's got beautiful feature, probably some of the best featured wood in the world, and so it can be used in a lot of internal flooring and things that really bring up a house and make it a organic, lively place to be.
So really, in Australia, we have an increasing demand for housing, for electricity poles, which is what these will be used for. And if we don't have supply in Australia, then effectively we have to get that supply from somewhere else, which is going to be throughout Southeast Asia and those sort of countries. And it's so important to have it in Australia because we can create an industry that provides jobs and is managed sustainably and has some sort of management to it, opposed to just going in and just taking out a huge amount of timber with no management.
We've got to take responsibility for this utilisation of this material. You can't just go willy-nilly, oh, well, not in my backyard, I want to bring it in from elsewhere. And that elsewhere has now mostly reached peak production, so they're well past the level of forest that's still available for harvest, and so it'll diminish strongly in the next 10 years because it's been cut out. Whereas in Australia, we've got like in Southeast Queensland, we've got 2 million hectares of private native forest that could produce 700,000 cubic metres per year if it was managed correctly. And we've got the opportunity for plantation. Now in Australia, there's very little hardwood plantation that's actually utilised for either sawn wood production or for pole production like this forest is. I mean, this is looking for electricity pole production, but in reality, some of these will fail on very strict specifications for electricity poles, and so they'll be utilised as a saw log and cut up into this beautiful honey-coloured wood that's highly durable and very strong. So it's a great combination. And unfortunately, the plantation sector, or the hardwood, particularly in Queensland, a lot of those early plantations failed pretty badly because of poor selection of species, poor site, and poor management. It just didn't work because of all of those factors. And so then they throw up their hands and say it can't work. Well, look around you, it can work. These are 24 years old, these trees, with an average diameter down here of about 48 centimetres diameter, some of them over 60 centimetres in that time. So, and as you can see, they're also, the product length is upwards of 20 to 25 metres. So that's a very productive piece of forest.
So with all those points that you've just discussed, do we have much support from the government to manage forest and log in Australia? Or?
Well, it's interesting. Across Australia now, native forests in particular are under enormous pressure. That they continuously moan and bemoan the fact that we're cutting trees down within a forest area. But I mean, in Queensland and New South Wales, you might come in there every 15 years or so and cut out about, sort of 15 trees per hectare of the 150 trees that sort of optimally should be there. So, you can see in reality, it's a very low impact, and a managed forest is a lot better environmentally and productive wise than an unmanaged forest. That's number one thing that needs to be understood. Forests that are unmanaged, that have been impacted in the past, and mostly regrowth forests obviously, are generally way overstocked and haven't got good environmental attributes, but a really well managed forest like this, the trees are well spaced. Trees like arboreal animals like yellow-bellied gliders and greater gliders, they're evolved over the millennium to glide 100 metres. Well, that's why they like to have a big open forest. And Australia before in European times probably had about 50 to 60 trees per hectare, very large trees, really well spaced, and managed primarily by fire by the Aboriginal population, and extremely well managed by fire, very complex fire regimes in those forests, and that allows for arboreal animals, but it also allows for ground-dwelling animals like potoroos and wallabies and kangaroos and the like. They require grasses to eat. If there isn't any grass over there because you've got too many trees, then they've got nothing to feed on, and so they won't be there.
Yeah, I think you can really see it even just throughout the property, just through all the plantations that we've got, just the amount of grassland that you've got under all of the trees, which, you look at some of the big fires that happened, I guess, through New South Wales and stuff in the last couple of years, just catastrophic fire events, and just the amount of fuel that's at the bottom of all of those forests that aren't being managed. And when you've got something like this that just demonstrates the different sort of undergrowth that you've got, this is sort of another advocate for sustainable management of forests.
That's a really, really big point. In the forests, the last lot of fires in New South Wales burned about 11 million hectares of forest country. 6 million hectares of that was national park, and about 4 million hectares were state forest, and the rest of it was privately owned forest. So then they tried to put the blame on the state forest for creating a fire environment. Well, it's just a nonsense argument. The problem is that we're not burning regularly enough to reduce the fuel loading and to drop those ladder fuels. You can see in this forest here, there's no ladder fuels. And ladder fuel is where you've got a heavy story undergrowth that the fire can start on and then start moving up through that undergrowth till you get to a height where it then flashes through to the crown. That's when you've got an uncontrollable fire that you just cannot put out. You can spend $40 million on a Boeing 747 bomber at something incredible, like $40,000 an hour to try and put it out, when you could have spent $1,000 and reduced the fire risk in those forests quite simply.
And not only spent money, you've got some sort of timber out of the forest as well. It wouldn't have needed to come out of Southeast Asia or something, and you're producing jobs in the country and producing an industry that is sustainable.
Well, particularly, most of these forests are in rural areas where you want not just seasonal work. You want work that's there all year round, and they're really good career opportunities, and frankly, they're feeding the timber supplies into the suburban and the city areas that are, funnily enough, like the nearer you get to the centre of these cities, the less likely they are to approve of any sort of cutting a tree down. They just have become obsessed by the fact that trees should never be cut down. But the reality is, you cut down a tree here, it'll regrow immediately. Either that, or you'll get regeneration enough to cover it. So, that is a truly sustainable industry. You're not having to dig up a dirty great hole in the ground, produce an enormous amount of power to convert it from either clay into brick, or bauxite into aluminium, or iron ore into steel, and then all the byproducts that comes out of it. The product is instant. It's there, it's grown, and you've got a building product. There's no other product is like it.
And I suppose if you're cutting the timber down, you're storing that carbon, opposed to if you're leaving a state forest unmanaged and then there is a major fire, that carbon is getting released into the atmosphere in CO2 when it gets burnt.
Yeah, that's not the only way it is too. Once the tree becomes old and senescent, in other words, once it starts to sort of reach past its sort of optimum growing age, it becomes senescent, and invariably we get hollow-bearing trees. That's what the arboreal animals require to live in. But the reality is, those trees are now being eaten by termites. Termites emit methane. Methane is 25 times worse than carbon dioxide from a global warming point of view. So, senescent trees and trees that are in decline and forests that are in decline aren't storing carbon at all. It's a fallacy and a nonsense. Whereas under the Kyoto protocols and subsequent sort of carbon accounting programs, us as foresters if we cut down a tree and we use that as a power pole, so most of that tree is actually utilised for the next 100 years as a power pole, and then can be reutilised after that power pole has reached its lifespan. That carbon, which is 50% of that tree is carbon, 50% of wood is carbon, that's locked up for more than 100 years. I mean, but we can't account for it under those protocols. And that's where things become very skewed to saying that, well, forests that are harvested aren't they're emitting carbon, not absorbing it. It's a nonsense, and it's because of the skewed version of forest management that has been pushed by the conservation movement, frankly.
And I guess that's why it's so important to have this sort of education. You'll look back. We're looking back at some videos of the forestry that was happening 100 years ago, and obviously there's been a significant amount of learning over that time on what to do and what not to do. And it's unfortunate now that probably we have a lack of university degrees around forestry management, and it seems to be a bit of a dying industry, and it's just important to keep the education up for people so they can understand what the actual process is.
It's so important, and people become, it's like, a bottle of milk or, a block of cheese. They have no concept of where that material came from, how it was produced. It's in the shop and it's in a bottle. That's the new sort of paradigm of where a product comes from. Well, the hard, cold reality is if you want timber, then you have to grow a tree and then you have to remove it out of the forest. Immediately after you remove that forest, it starts to rehabilitate itself, and the tree will either coppice from the stump or regeneration will take its place. And so you've got a continuous cycle of timber production. That's what sustainability is.
That's why they call it actual sustainability.
It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a word that's become a weasel word in a lot of ways because people don't really understand what it means. But the reality is, you're removing timber as fast as you can grow it. That's when you become truly sustainable.
Right. So maybe we'll just touch base on what the actual process that you've developed here over 25 years. So you planted these trees 25 years ago. And I guess now we're at the point where you're starting to do some sort of more significant harvesting.
So when we established the plantation, we planted at around 800 to 1,000 stems per hectare. So that's we're talking about 5 metres by about 2.5 metres on the row. It's pretty hard to actually see where the rows are now because it's been thinned down to probably about 180 stems per hectare. So it's been thinned probably 4 times in that period. So the first one was really, by the end of year 1, the trees were 6 metres high. They grow very quickly if you do the right site establishment and weed control and you have good quality seedlings from a good provenance. So by about year 5, we reduced that down to 500 stems per hectare. So that immediately becomes 5 by 5 metres. That's equivalent to 500 stems per hectare. Then you thin it again by about year 8 or 9, down to 350 stems per hectare. And from that point onwards, the thinnings become utilisable. And so by year 15 in this plantation, we had a actual small round wood harvest. So for small poles up to sort of 12.5 metres, a lot of fencing material for the smaller rounds. So, by that stage, we were actually starting to recoup some of the costs of establishing the plantation. And from that point onwards, then, the actual, the economic returns or the calculation against the investing it into some other form of monetary fund becomes a lot better. The equation becomes a lot better. So now we're down to, this has been harvested 3 times now. So we've had the first harvest in 2015, planted in 2000. First harvest was in 2015. The second harvest was in 2021. And now this current harvest that we've just completed now in 2024. All of those are still very much thinning harvest. So the returns are starting to creep up quite significantly. Obviously, you can see now that we're at the the top end. You know, so over the next 10 years, I'll continue to pick through these plantations and remove trees like this one that have come up to the optimal tree value. So, because we're talking about electricity poles, you can see these trees are very straight and very tall. So we can get a 23 metre, even a 27 metre pole out of this, which is worth, you know, in excess of $1,500 standing if it gets approved as a pole. So I bring my tape measure down. That's the diameter tape I was talking about earlier. I flick it around. The poles are measured 2 metres from the ground. So that's 53 centimetres over bark. Okay, that's the diameter. So poles are actually measured under bark. So we need to take, say, 4 centimetres off the bark for the bark. So that one's about 49 centimetres under bark for that tree. So that I really need to have that at 50 centimetres under bark for it to be a maximum value 23 metre pole. So it's not quite ready yet. I looked at it first and I thought this one's ready, but actually it's about 1 centimetre short. Considering some other trees I cut down and the thickness of the bark, I was underestimating the thickness of the bark a little bit. So
what's that got? Just another couple more years, has it? Or
look, these grow more than 2 centimetres diameter a year at the moment. So you can see it's less than 25 years old and it's virtually 50 centimetres. Well, it's 53 centimetres. So
yeah,
it's actually grown over that whole time more than 2 centimetres diameter a year. And even though it's this big, it's still growing at 2 centimetres a year because I measured that a couple of years ago with 46. I've still got the measurement written up there, you know. And so that was only 2 years ago I measured that, and now it's 50. So
right. And just for context, when you first planted this, there was a sapling that was
that's right.
this high.
Well, that high, yeah,
Right.
that's right. Yeah.
So in 25 years,
Yes.
or 24 years, it's gone from that to something like this.
Look at the amount of carbon in that. You know, tell me that this isn't a sustainable industry, and I'll buy to eat my hat. You know, and I'm very attached to my hat. So you know, I'm proud of it. I'm happy with it. I think it's just a fantastic thing to do.
Yeah, and so we've recently just done one harvest, and we've got about 40 poles out of it, and obviously, you know, that demonstrated that this species in this area is working pretty effectively as well.
Yeah, in fact, we've got more than 80 poles out of it, and quite a range of saw logs and fencing on top of that. And it was a very minor harvest. Okay, so it certainly, and now you can see that the number of trees around you, and while I haven't encouraged regeneration or even coppice in this forest to date, now I will, because over the next 10 years, you know, the framework of these trees will be removed and the young ones will come up to take its place. So I won't have to plant again. I'm quite convinced of that. When I encourage regeneration, I can just, you know, when it gets closer to leaving the framework of seed trees in here, I'll burn this and you'll get a very significant regeneration event from that if there's not enough coppice to take the place of the trees I'll remove.
Excellent. So we've got a few more trees marked out, and we'll cut a few more, and yeah, this will finish off the harvest for this year, and then we'll look at probably doing another harvest in a year or two.
Yeah, we've certainly got left trees like this one here that really only needs another centimetre or two to get to the point, and there's I think there was 4 trees in here that are over 23 metres that I'll do exactly that to, and then these others will actually maintain their growth because we're taking out some of these larger trees.
So then they're not competing against each other as much, and they're getting more sunlight, and they'll become the dominant tree.
Yeah, that's right. And then they if they don't grow faster, they'll certainly grow at the rate that they're growing, so they're not diminishing at all.
All right, well, let's get into it. Right, so now that we've cut the log down and we've dragged it here with the grapple and the tractor, you've debarked it with the tractor and maybe a little bit of hand debarking with the shovel. What's the next stage in the process?
Okay, you have to inspect the pole then. Firstly, as I said, when we're looking at a tree, the measurement is at 2 metres from the butt end, so that's what they call a D line. That measurement there will tell us then what strength rating is, and that's what you actually paid on, the length and the strength rating of the pole. Then you start to have a look at it and see if there are any defects on this pole that's going to knock it out from a pole conditions, and things like knots or grown over knots, branches that have, you have to look at those branches to make sure that there's no actual holes or defects in that branches. One is trimmed back a little bit further. They all look good and solid. They're all light branches. Generally light branches are good. You have to trim these branches back to the pole face. This pole is good. It'll certainly be an approved pole right through to where it starts to fork. So that's about a 17-metre pole, I expect. There's, because you've got to grow to an Australian standard, there's a whole book on the standards of what's required. But when it comes down to stem fault, whether it be a grub hole, a faulty knot from a branch, or the degree of bow or crook that might be in the pole. So most of the time, you're allowed a sort of a 10% bend. So you measure that from the D line to the top of the bend, and if that deviates more than 10% of the diameter, then it fails as a pole. And the same to go with the crook. It's a degree measurement over the crook length, which is all specified in the actual pole specifications. So while it requires to meet those standards, and those standards are relatively high, it's not that difficult to work out if it's going to be a pole or not. I'll grab this one, then I'll trim this off up and cut it to length. I'll measure the D line, write that on the bottom, take it over to a set of runners so that it can be inspected by a pole purchaser, and they do the final inspection to approve it. And then it gets taken out, as you saw in the video, where the truck comes along and picks it up with the crane.
So what are you doing here? You're spraying the logs before they get loaded on the truck?
Yeah, these spotter gum, and the sapwood on that is liquid susceptible, which is a little tiny pinhole borer, and they don't want the sapwood to deteriorate before it gets treated. It's got to dry for 6 months before they actually treat it. So other than messmate, we don't have to spray, but the spotter gum we do have to spray. And that sort of keeps them intact really for the 6 months before they actually treat it, and then that prevents it forever then.